Welcome to Moments with Marianne. This is your host, Marianne Pastana. And we're here today with special guest, Daniel C. Munson, who's here to share with us his new book, Fiscal Follies, A Little Fun with Economics and Economists. So can economics really be called a science if its predictions so often fail? Well, today's guest is here to share with us just that. Daniel C. Munson is a graduate of the University of Minnesota with a BS in Chemical Engineering and the William Mitchell College of Law with a professional background in chemical engineering, law, and financial management. With over 2 decades, he has written for national financial publications including Barron's and Financial History, bringing a sharp, multidisciplinary perspective to complex economic issues. In his latest book, Fiscal Follies, Munson examines the intersection of economics, finance, and technology, arguing that unlike the hard science, economics is riddled with flawed assumptions and imprecise thinking. So welcome to the show, Daniel C. Munson.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
Well, my goodness, what an honor it is to have you here and to talk about this book. I'd love for you to share with us what inspired you to write this.
Well, I thought that there was a gap in the literature that I thought that I could fill a little bit. Much of the literature in economics and finance is about predicting the future, and it's done largely through merely focusing on economic and financial matters and not quite enough on technology and on the history of economics and finance, which I think is quite fascinating and often very illuminating and is not talked about as much as it should be. That is to say that the history that is not just merely wars and politics, the history of the development of our technological and financial world.
Well, I really was intrigued on how you open Fiscal Follies by questioning whether or not economics qualifies as a science. What led you to that conclusion, and why does it matter today?
I think the thing that got me started was just the practical application of doing chemical engineering for many years and contrasting the work that I did, the work of chemical engineering, and with my readings in the literature in economics and in finance, and contrasting the two and noting the differences between them.
With your background in chemical engineering and law, how has that shaped your critical perspective on modern economics and financial theory?
Well, when you're doing chemical engineering, it's quite a practical endeavor, and you ask a question that you don't encounter much in academia and not as much in specifically in economics and finance. You don't ask simply whether there's an equation governing a particular situation. You probe a little further and you ask, is the equation any good? There are plenty of equations, or sometimes they're referred to as models, especially in the academic world, which are simply not reliable enough to justify shelling out money to commercialize a process. Oftentimes, a chemical process involves a series of unit steps. Each one has to perform at very, very high rates of efficiency in order for the system to really work, to avoid having to throw quite a bit of your input raw material away. I remember once listening to Jordan Peterson, the clinical psychologist who's become kind of a famous public speaker currently, and he was talking about the literature in clinical psychology. And he commented once that in the literature, he was talking about a particular paper where the relationship between two variables was about 44%. And he said, that's pretty good for clinical psychology. Well, in physics and chemistry and engineering, 44% is not good enough. It's not remotely good enough to commercialize or to consider the relationship between the variables to be established.
In your book, you make a clear distinction between the precision of the hard sciences and the ambiguity of economics. Can you explain the difference using a real-world example from the book?
Well, I think a good one might be the recent COVID shutdown. we were told by government economists that spending quite a bit of government money, over $1 trillion, at a time when many businesses were not operating, would not cause inflation. And later, when inflation occurred, we were told it would be short-lived or transitory. Well, these were inaccurate predictions, but the political winds allowed economists to say things that could not be shown to be absolutely wrong. In other words, it was plausible. It could have, okay, it was, there was the consensus of opinion among economists was slightly negative, maybe 70-30 or 60-40 that it couldn't work, that would cause inflation. But the point is, it wasn't absolutely clear. And that shows that ambiguity in economics that doesn't exist really in the hard sciences to that degree.
In Fiscal Follies, you highlight how economic theories often fail when tested in the real world. Why do these theories still gain so much traction in government and media?
Well, I think because they flatter people's ideas about the world. We'd like to believe certain things are true. And politicians take this a little bit, but this little failure of human nature, this tendency of humans to sort of kid themselves, to lie to themselves a little bit about whether certain things are really possible, or whether we shouldn't expect perhaps something other than what we expect to happen.
In your book, you mention that many economists avoid reviewing the outcomes of past policies. Why do you think this economic accountability is so rare?
Well, most economists are not temperamentally historians. They like to use their skills to shape future economic policies. I can concede that reviewing your past mistakes is not fun. So if they don't have to, they might not like to. But I like to quote the great Oxford historian Paul Johnson, who famously wrote that the study of history is a powerful antidote to contemporary arrogance. It is humbling to discover how many of our glib assumptions, which seem to us novel and plausible, have been tested before, not once, but many times, and in innumerable guises, and discovered to be, at great human cost, completely false.
It would seem if we don't review our past mistakes, how are we ever going to learn from them?
That's the old adage about those who do not study history are doomed to repeat it, and I think that's true with economics, but it's very difficult in a world where we're always trying to solve the current problem, to imagine a solution that's a little bit more convenient, that maybe with the advantage of history we might realize is probably not the correct solution.
I really appreciate how your book features some very witty and sharp critiques. What role does humor play in helping readers process serious economic failures?
Well, I like to quote Mark Twain, who said, "Comedy is tragedy plus time." In other words, that which might have been tragic or very, very difficult at the time, with the passage of 100 years or so, we can see the mistakes that were made, and maybe have a little fun, or look at it with our knowledge of the human condition, and our willingness to look at our forebears as maybe not as smart as we are, to see that maybe we could do something different in the future. And the other thing is that I'd hope that humor is a lighter and more enjoyable form of criticism than simply harping on about past mistakes. I enjoy the math and science in the book as much as anybody, but I concede it's not everybody's cup of tea. The math that I do review is not higher math. It's not extremely difficult, but it does force the reader to pay some close attention. So humor acts to break up some of the readings, and it teaches us we should be more modest about our ability to engineer society, and we should learn a little from our past mistakes, and acknowledge a little bit the reality of the human condition.
Well, to dovetail with that, I mean, your book, you discuss the 2008 housing crisis in detail. What do you think was the most misunderstood element of that financial collapse?
Yes, I had I did analyze that a little bit, and I think it's another example where you have to go back in time and think about the situation as it was 20 or 25 years ago. By the mid 2000s, housing prices, nationally anyway, had been going up almost without interruption for nearly 40 years. So people began to assume that housing prices might never go down. Financial types then began to create products predicated on this assumption. They created the 30 years, zero down, no documentation, option arm product that would have caused some of our grandparents who worked in banking would have given them apoplexy. But it only took a small decline in prices beginning as 2006 to cause the whole edifice to crumble, because even though the problems initially were confined to only a small part of the mortgage market, say the subprime mortgage market, we did not anticipate the extent to which that there would be knock-on effects in the entire market for houses. In fact, houses that were owned by people who had placed a mortgage on the property and were fully capable of making the payments, because mortgages in the United States are non-recourse loans. A wealthy person who could make the payments did not see any reason to make the payments if the value of the house was hundreds of thousands of dollars less than the mortgage balance. They would simply send the keys back to the mortgage holder, and so the problems just snowballed. I think it's useful to recall that how sensitive market for homes is, and the market for mortgages, to the assumptions that were prices of homes.
You have a few chapters like Wall Street to Pay and The Banker Gets a Makeover, which critiques the financial elite. What do most people get wrong about Wall Street's role in our economy?
That's a good question. Wall Street is important. There's no getting around that. But it's also important to realize how trend dependent it is and how it's driven by the sale of securities. That is to say, by salesmen. Now, we don't call them salesmen on Wall Street. We call them investment bankers. But it's basically the same thing. And investment bankers find it much easier to sell securities if there's a little bit of bullishness surrounding or underpinning a particular assumption. You can see that in the market for mortgages that they created in the 2000s. Those would have not been saleable 10 years before, so therefore they would never have been created in the first place. It's when the salesmen on Wall Street, the investment bankers, find an opportunity to sell securities that things can sometimes get out of hand. But the good news, or the thing that you have to acknowledge about Wall Street, is it's always looking for new opportunities. It's always looking ambitiously towards the next new thing, which might change the world. It's just that they're occasionally wrong in anticipating what will happen in the future, as we all are.
Well, I have to congratulate you. I mean, Garrett Baldwin called Fiscal Follies the financial book of the year and praised it for its clarity. What do you hope readers take away from this book that they won't get from traditional economic literature?
Well, I hope they get some interesting stories, some fun facts about the world. I don't expect readers to conclude that there is some magical money-making scheme in the book, or that all can be explained with a simple bullet point. The world, that, as I see it, the interplay between economics, finance, and technology is complicated, but it's very interesting. And if you give yourself the time to read through some of these historical accounts, I think you'll find them very interesting and enlightening. And in many cases, you'll be told a story you have never been told before. I tell the story in the book of the tremendous change in the world that occurred at Niagara Falls in the 1890s, when the world's first great hydroelectric project, which channeled the tremendous flow of the flow of water over Niagara Falls and used it to spin turbines and generate massive amounts of electricity. And the technological hurdle to overcome was to figure out how to transmit all of that power all the way to Buffalo, New York, which was 25 miles away, the nearest large city, the city that could pay, whose citizens could pay the cost of this tremendous project. So in learning the story, you see the interplay between economics and finance and technology at its best. And it's a fascinating story that is seldom told, although 100 years ago, everybody understood how important that project was to the changing the world.
So you weave in references to films, plays, and even song lyrics to illustrate economic ideas. How do these cultural touchstones help us better understand the flaws or even absurdities in economic thinking?
Well, I think these movies and plays and lyrics, they can capture a moment in time so perfectly. I like to use the example in the book of the movie It's a Wonderful Life, where this is a movie people enjoy at Christmas time, especially because the pivotal events occur on Christmas Eve. But the story is really of the battle between George Bailey and his Bailey Building and Loan, the became what we call savings and loans, was battling with old man Potter, the old wizened banker in town who didn't think that the average citizen of the town of Bedford Falls could really pay off a mortgage, and so he refused to create mortgages and to allow people to build their own houses, whereas George Bailey and his building and loan was doing just that. And the reason it's so interesting is that the mortgage market changed tremendously in the, say, between 1938 and 1948, in a way that the movie, which was made in 1946, it hints at this new future that George Bailey and his building and loan would bring about. That is to say, the increasing predictability, the employment prospects of the average citizen were increasing and improving by leaps and bounds, and they could perhaps pay off a mortgage in monthly installments over the course of 20 or 30 years. Another example I use in the book, a little bit more fun, maybe a little different, is the Beatles song "Tax Man" that I describe in the book. It was written by George Harrison, and the lyric, if you recall, was described the tax man telling George, "Let me tell you how it will be. There's one for you, 19 for me." And the backstory to this is that George wrote this song in April of 1966 when he was confronted with his 1965 tax bill. The Beatles were tremendously successful in 1965. They made all kinds of money. They did not realize that above a certain level of income, the British taxing authorities were going to tax their income at 95%. So when he wrote that lyric, he was saying something that was literally true. There's one for you, 19 for me is a tax rate of 95%. This was he had no idea that his tax bill would be so high. He could not pay it at the time. He and one of the other Beatles, I think too, was threatened with bankruptcy because they could not pay their 1965 tax bill. They undoubtedly figured out some way to pay it. But so again, it's the way art inadvertently gives us a beautiful insight into a moment in time that I think is useful to recall. And in fact, I think it's the lesson of economic history indicate that tax rates of over 80 and 90% simply do not work. People go to tremendous lengths to avoid paying at those rates.
That's just insane that that rate is even something that would be
That
available for
right,
people.
that it was even considered but I'm sure at the time politically it seemed like, well, these are wealthy people, they should be able to pay. But one of the points I make in the book that what society had in mind, what they were assuming was that the people subject to this tax would be rich landowners, maybe inherited wealth. Well, it was easy to not like those people, but we didn't realize that with the tremendous progress of society, that young men in their 20s who were wildly popular would end up having to pay those tax rates.
And we're not even considering operating expenses for people. That would be insane.
Well, that idea has kind of gone out. That's one thing. Economics has and finance has, I think, internalized this rule that marginal tax rates of over 60 and 70% simply don't work. They've been tried a couple of times. They were tried in the U.S. to try to pay for World War I, and then they were tried again to try to pay for World War II. The British tried it the same way. The Scandinavians tried it, and in all cases, all of those places have discontinued tax rates of excess of 50 and 60% because they have too many unanticipated side effects.
Well, Daniel, Fiscal Follies is such a just a profound read. I know our listeners, they can pick up a copy at Amazon. Is that right?
That's right. Yes. The publisher is Keynote Books, the division of Defiance Press. Yes.
Well, Daniel, thank you so much for taking the time to be on the show with us here today.
Thank you.
Well, thank you, Daniel. It's been such an honor to spend this time with you and to talk about your new book, Fiscal Follies, a little fun with economics and Economists. Fiscal Follies is available at Amazon, Barnes & Noble, and everywhere books are sold. And remember, support our indie bookstores. If you don't see it on the shelf, just ask for them to order it. Well, we're at the end of our time today. I'd like to thank everyone for tuning in. You've been listening to Moments with Mary Ann, where we make every moment count.
In a single moment, your life can change. Moments with Mary Ann is a transformative hour that covers an endless array of topics with the best of the best. Her guests are leaders in their fields, ranging from inspirational authors, top industry leaders, and business and spiritual entrepreneurs. Each guest is gifted and a true visionary, a recognized leader in her own work, and while teaching others to develop, refocus, and grow, Mary Ann will bring the best guest and sometimes a special surprise. Don't miss this. You never know just which moment will change your life forever. Make sure to tune in and visit momentswithmaryann.com for more information.